Do you have any questions before we get started? We're going to wrap up Chapter 15 on international trade today. We left off last time incorporating a supply and demand framework into our discussion about benefits of trade. So you can kind of reference back. You don't necessarily need to draw this part. In general, in this class, anything I put on the board, you put on your paper. But this is kind of a recap. I'm not sure I'm going to say anything too new here. You had those three graphs side by side. And we were trying to get a feel for the exchange going on. Oh, sorry. Is it still on? I don't want to cause trip hazard. Yeah, we're looking at that. Okay. Between the two markets. How you doing? Oops, we had Japan here, didn't we? I introduced you to my eyeball trick. And the idea here is that producers and consumers, exporters and importers get together in the world market. Somebody brought up last time, I can't remember who, that how does this two-country extend into the real world? So first of all, the production possibilities argument, where we had two countries with two goods, cars and food, and one resource, was kind of a stretch compared to the real world. However, I want you to know that some economists have done some great work in extending that model to N countries with N goods and N resources. In other words, it applies to real world models where we have lots of goods, lots of countries, and lots of resources. So it's not just this little tiny carve out that really doesn't apply to reality. It can, the drawings, if they're even possible, or the mathematics can get very complex. That's why we do the nice simple approach for principles class. With this, we had a country that wanted to purchase food and one that wanted to sell. What was the United States in this case? They were the seller. So what did we call them in international terms? The exporter. So they happen to have a low cost of producing the good. And I guess I'll stick for now with numbers. So they can produce soda at $2 per bottle. So if we had our food product was soda, then without anybody out there in the rest of the world, given their resources and technology, the United States could produce and consume very happily at $2. Over in Japan, their resource base made them a higher cost producer of soda. And it cost them $5 to make every unit of food. And so there was room for these two parties to get together and make each other better off. So how does this get into more and more countries? I just want to give you one small little glimpse that I think will make sense to you. Imagine that there's another country over here that is a low-cost producer at $3. And there's another country that's a low-cost producer at $1.75. And there's another country here that's a low-cost producer at $1.20. All of these countries would find that they can operate at a lower cost than what the world might converge in at. Likewise, there's other high-cost countries out there too. And so there's some country out here that's doing it at $6, and there's another country that's doing it at $4.75, and there's another country out here. And so if we line up all of the potential high-cost countries and low-cost countries and let them have a battle royale in the world market, what's going to come about is the world price. And it's a balancing act then of how much this country is willing to import, how much this country is willing to import, how much this country is willing to import, that ultimately creates the import demand curve here in the real world. And likewise here, we've got a bunch of countries that are relatively low cost. This country is going to export, they're going to be a fairly large exporter. This country is going to be a decent exporter. This one's going to be relatively small. To those three, we're going to add up, and that's what's going to bring to market all the export supply. And so together, the aggregate behavior of a number of different players with different resource bases, all with different unique attributes within their nation's boundaries, are going to come together in this world marketplace, and the world will live as one. Imagine all the people. Right? So we got some sort of world price here gets negotiated through the invisible hand of individual behavior. We get a market price. And there's a strange thing that comes out in economics with free markets. There's this amazing coordination of efforts without anybody leading the way. We don't have the United Nations or some other world organization saying the price of food needs to be $3. Nobody's directing traffic. This is an amazing thing that happens in marketplaces, that a very decentralized system with self-interested agents can end up in a fairly coordinated effort in the distribution of resources to get food or soda out to the rest of the world. And what we have then is a system where low-cost countries, because of their resource base, are the ones supplying it. That's who we'd want supplying it, right? The low-cost countries. And the high-cost countries are the ones buying it because they have a comparative advantage in something else. And they're supplying something else to the market that they have, in turn, a low cost of doing. Pretty cool stuff. All right, let me open that up to comment or question. Yeah, Katie.
Okay, is the triangle with, like, for Japan, like, their cost we decided was 5, right?
Yes.
Okay. The difference between
arbitrary,
the world,
yeah.
So the difference between the world price and the cost is that their consumer surplus?
We're not getting into consumer surplus. I don't even want to address your question. Afterwards, I will be happy to. This class does not need to know consumer surplus, if you knew that word. Katie is an econ major pushing the boundaries of economics, which I love, but we'll talk after class. Okay? Any other comments that I can shoot down real quick? No. I'd love to entertain any comments or questions. All right, so where we're going with this now, I'm trying to sell you on the free market type situation where everything can work out, but we know that that's not the way world trade ends up shaking down, because there ends up being political lobbies and protection going out to protect certain parties. Maybe whoever is slipping a politician enough money in their campaign fund gets some preferential treatment that they're going to tax their other countries to keep those cheap foreign imports from coming into the country, right? So that's where we're taking this next, and that's where a large part of the chapter looks at regulation and or intervention in world trade. So, I want to start off with the question we left last time. Why do people complain about free trade if it benefits all countries? Why do people complain about free trade if it benefits all countries? All right, well, we talked about it last time, but I didn't write anything on the board, so I wanted to capture that last thought. all of these countries have different prices, notice, right? I said this one had $1.75, this one was $2, this one was $1.20, this one was $2.25, this one was 5, 7, 8, whatever. And as soon as we open up for free trade, prices will gravitate towards a new equilibrium. There'll be one price for the world price. Which means those countries that had higher prices now have lower prices. But those countries that used to have low prices now have a little bit higher prices. And so within each country, we have consumers and producers, one of which isn't going to like that situation. So producers want to have high prices because they're going to make more profit from higher prices. Consumers want low prices, just like you guys do when you go shopping at the grocery store or Walmart. Low prices make you have more opportunities and more stuff, if that's your thing. So why do people complain about free trade if it benefits all countries? Because within each country, there will be winners and losers from trade. And where that comes from is consumers like low prices. Producers like high prices. High sale prices. They get more for their product. Consumers like low prices. Producers like high prices. And when we start trading, prices change. Price will either rise or lower to the world price when a country opens to trade, which means there's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser. What we spent so much time proving was that the winner's wins are bigger than the loser's losses, because every country is going to have a net gain from trade. So the key is that there are gains. And this is kind of just being a little bit loose-lipped here, but winners wins. The winners wins are greater than the losers' losses. Comments or questions on that? So our next topic is trade restrictions. If the losers are able to get policy changed, that'll have an impact on the market. So, give me some examples. You've heard of some. Maybe you did your homework a little ahead of time, but maybe you didn't. I don't really care. Just something that you heard from the news. What types of things would be called a trade restriction that you've heard about? Tariffs. Good. So tariff is kind of a fancy word. You know what a tariff is in more simpler terms? A tax. It's just a tax on the imports. That's why we call it a tariff instead of a tax, so that we know that it's related to international trade. It's a tax on imports. So the importing country is now going to tax those Toyotas before they get to the American borders and collect some money, which is going to alter the price. What other sort of trade restrictions? Import quotas, good. So just in general, a quota, which is a restriction on the quantity, a legal restriction on the quantity of imports. So instead of messing around with the price, is what a tax effectively does, the tariff does, we're going to mess around with the quantity. So we're currently importing 1,000 Toyotas, and we're going to say, that's it, we're cutting that in half. Only 500 Toyotas are able to come across. All right, what else? Other sort of things might inhibit trade. They might kind of restrict trade.
Well, I don't know if there's a technical term for it, but like if a country refuses to trade with another country for like diplomatic reasons. Or
Okay, good. So yes, that's so if we don't agree with communism, right? So we've had a trade embargo. We're just not trading with Cuba, for instance. So we can have political issues. So for example, Cuba, we have a trade embargo. We just don't trade with them at all. No Cuban cigars for those Americans. Now, I kind of suspect with Fidel Castro aging and now as close to his deathbed as he can be, and trade and changes going on in Cuba, I think there's a good chance within your guys' lifetime that you might be able to get some Cuban cigars. I think that's going to change. I think the Cold War era is when it started back in the 60s, and now things are changing. There'll be new people in power. What are some other possibly political, moral type of issues that might restrict trade? Or anything else, Katie, if you were thinking of something else.
Well, like, I know, like, if you go to, like, Mexico or something, you can't bring back, like, the fruit with you because it has, like, the pesticides or something.
Okay. So this might be kind of related to that, but national security. If we don't want their germs coming across, or their pesticides, or little critters that are on their particular stuff, we might have strict standards that in order for that fruit to come into our borders, we have to have maybe a United States customs official or some person that works for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're inspecting the fruit as it comes through, and we only work with maybe certain suppliers that we've been certified safe. We know where it's grown. We know the processes that they take place. So we're kind of entering a regulation type realm for that. So which has costs associated with it, of course. Okay, other things coming to mind. We're missing one big kind of hot button. Cambodia and Malaysia and sewing machines and workers. What might be an issue? That child labor, we start getting into restrictions. Now, it doesn't even necessarily have to be child labor, but maybe the company is a bit coercive and they're able to more or less have slave labor in a sense, or they're able to demand 80-hour work weeks. And so, well, hey, we're in America. You should only have to work 40 hours. That's abuse. Whether it's not necessarily child abuse, but even on the way they do things. So those sorts of things can cause trade restrictions as well. So I'll just throw a couple of those up here. Child labor. Another big one Environmental issues. Well, in America, we only allow a certain X amount of parts per million of nasty stuff to be spewed into the atmosphere, and all these countries are going over to Mexico or Malaysia, and they don't have those same standards. Well, that's not fair. So possibly we could require that in order for us to trade with a particular country, you have to be producing at the American standard. So all of this stuff can tend to cause issues in trade. All right, so I'm going to start with the tariff and show the effects of that for our country. So I think we'll put on our Japan hat. And let's do two graphs side by side. One of them is going to be without the tariff, and one of them is going to be with the tariff. This is kind of how your textbook writes it as well. Let's go ahead and put up some sort of supply and demand curve. What I'd like you to do is make them identical to each other. So suppose that the no trade price is 5. And then I kind of want you to just make as best you can, a mirror image over here to the right. This is all the no trade price, so we're just kind of thinking of case A, case B. What's the difference? Okay, so we learned last time that the interaction of the export supply and import demand is going to create a world price. And that's going to have an impact here. If Japan happens to have a comparative advantage in some other good, so if this is our quantity of food and the price of food, then the world price is going to be something lower than that. So let's go with our $3 world price. So without any sort of tariff, we're not going to let, the government's not in the picture yet. So under a free market, a free world trade scenario, then Japanese consumers are going to want to buy 300 units of food, just making up a number. So the quantity demanded at a world price of $3, they'd like to be consuming 300 units. That 300 units then is going to be delivered to them in two different ways. One way through Japanese producers. So the Japanese producers are on this supply curve because I'm in Japan, so that's our domestic production. So Japanese producers are going to supply 100 units of those, and the rest of the world row is going to make up the difference, and that gives us our quantity of imports. Okay, so that's the same story we told already before. Now we're going to impose a tariff. And so for this country, they're going to add $1 tariff at the border, let's say. So they're going to charge $1 to every import that comes in. What's going to happen if we effectively charge $1 to each one of those producers? Well, within the country, I'm going to extend this graph over here. So this is the world price. The world price plus the buck gets us up to 4. So the world price plus little t, the world price plus t, the tariff. So let t equal $1. is going to raise the price within the country to 4. And consumers are going to buy less than what they did before. Just to help motivate things, I'll cut back their consumption by 30 units. Let's just say they go down to 270. Higher prices, we buy less. That was the law of demand. Price goes up, we buy less. Now, the more interesting thing here, well, maybe not more interesting, but equally as interesting, is that the Japanese producers are going to be producing more. So let's say they ramped up 30 units to 130. So if the intent of the tariff was to help domestic producers in Japan, was it successful? It was. Now, at what expense? Consumers, right? So they're paying an extra buck more, and producers are ramping up production. Now, the tariff ends up bringing in some money too. So the quantity of imports is now this horizontal distance. I'm getting a little small there, but hopefully you got the gist of it here. So here we had 200 units coming in. Now how much is being imported? 140. So imports have gone down to 140. Well, that sounds good, except for the consumers, right? So that's the effect of a tariff. Less imports, more domestic production. Now, the problem with that is that the gains to the producer are less than what the consumer is paying. And so we have what we call a deadweight loss to that policy. So, which should be, maybe I shouldn't say obvious, but it's the exact argument we had about opening up to trade in reverse. So let's show the results of the tariff here. Consumers pay more. In other words, they lose from the tariff. Producers receive a higher price and increase production. Let's go ahead and put the word domestic on there. Increase domestic production. Yes? It's the domestic producers only. So foreigners are producing less, domestic producers are making more. So they get a higher price and they bump up their production. You want to put in parentheses here, from 100 to 130 on our numbers that we're using here.
So are we assuming that the $1 tariff is going to the producer?
No. It's actually not going. That's where we're going to get to here in a second. So they're benefiting without even talking about the tariff money, because, and this is where it's a little tricky, so you might want to put a note down. All that happens within our nation is that prices rise to 4 because of the tariff. We don't know why, they just tend to go up. And so the protection that the government gave by imposing the tariff results in higher prices. Domestic producers don't have to pay that tariff, so they just enjoy a higher price. So they get kind of a free ride on just a higher price going on within the nation.
Is it the world government that imposes the tariff?
No, the Japanese government
So they're the
imposes
ones
the
who's
tariff.
gonna get the
Yes, they're ultimately going to get the tariff revenue, which is where Rachel is going. So with the tariff, yeah, this is a good note to put down here. Japan government imposes the tariff. So, consumers pay more, they lose, producers receive a higher price, they win. And then the other result is that we have tariff revenue. This is just government tax collections. We have tariff revenue equal to little t times the quantity of imports. So using my numbers, the government's collecting $140. Imports fell to 140. Government collects $1 on every one, so there's $140 worth of government revenue that then the government can choose to fund whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to go back towards anybody. It could go to compensate those poor consumers that got kind of jacked on this one, but that's not likely to happen. Okay. All right, so that's a tariff in a nutshell here. The big conclusion that I want you to walk away with is that in the grand scheme of life, in the big picture of allocating, little John Lennon style, imagine all the people, if we can just make ourselves better off, the people who suck at making food are making more of it, and the people that are good at it are making less of it. Does that sound like a good move to make from a global standpoint? No. Right? So the people who were providing the goods before, they had a lower cost. They were better at it. Their resource base allowed them to be better. They had a comparative advantage. And so the tariff is undoing that. And it's really distorting the picture in a bad way, since we've got producers who are the high-cost ones making more and the low-cost producers making less. So key point. Producers who suck at making the good produce more. These are, in this case, the Japanese producers, using our little example here. And the people who are awesome at producing the good produce less. And the producers that are rock stars at making the good produce less. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that the last, especially 70 years, countries have started to organize themselves to reduce tariffs. So this type of logic went on for a large period of time on international trade, because they're like, oh, well, we got to protect ourselves. This is our American-made stuff, and so it wasn't until the 1930s, 1940s that major industrialized countries started to embrace the logic here that, hey, we can both be made better off by lowering trade restrictions, by lowering tariff boundaries. Because the beauty of this is that if you start to understand this, if we now lower the tariff, we start to unravel the mess, right? As soon as we lower the tariff, now the good producers make more and the bad producers make less. And we start to get the benefits from opening up to trade. Okay. Questions or comments there? Yeah.
Are the imports, is that the world market, like it could be in multiple different countries, or is that just from one other country that was good at it?
That can be multiple. Yeah, could go either way.
You said earlier that there was a dead-weight loss
Oh.
what it was.
I'm not going to identify the area here and get into that because that would get into consumer surplus, which can be done. But the reduction of quantities and having producers produce more, so the loss to consumers to the benefit of producers makes the economic pie shrink by these little two triangles at the end of the day. And so I'm glad you brought that up because for one thing I wanted to do the tariff revenue as this box. So I want you to highlight on your graph this little green arrow. By the way, some of you might want to bring multiple colors. I see a few people, that's kind of handy looking back in your notes. Otherwise, black and white works, but the colors tend to pop out. So that area is the tariff revenue. So the geometry here would be a rectangle, base times height. The base is the quantity of imports, 140, and the height is the amount of the tariff. So that would give you the tariff revenue visually on the graph. Okay, anything else?
So what we need to know anything about that loss?
Just that there is
We don't
waste that we don't get back,
know,
which
we
is
don't need to know the area of the triangle.
right. Well, I guess as long as you brought it up, it's not too hard to add here. These little guys right here is the waste, dead weight loss. And so we've talked about it a lot here. The overall loss to society, that's it. Graphically, that's it. Okay, let's go to a quota. I want to do the same thing with the same country, start fresh though. So hopefully you can draw this a little quicker now because we're going to put the same thing up here. The no trade price for Japan. We're going to have a world price of food equal to 3. Get yourself set up the same way we just did. This is going to be the free trade, and this is going to be with a quota. So imagine we've got the same numbers we did before, 100 and 300. There's the quantity of imports. 200 units are being imported from the rest of the world under the free trade scenario. Now this time, I'm going to say that we're not going to allow 60 of those units in, so we're going to have a quota of 140 units. So only 140 units are allowed into our nation's boundaries. What happens? We're not going to mess with price, but currently there's this much. Now we're only going to allow 140. So if you've got a different color, you can kind of track with this. If you got a big fat pencil, you can draw a little bit of something different. But the quota is going to be 140, which would be this horizontal distance, right? So we used to have 200. Now only 140 is going to be allowed into our country. Okay, now we've got a problem. The quantity being supplied at a current price of $3, the quantity being supplied within Japan is 240 units. 140 from the rest of the world, 100 from our good old domestic producers. But people want to buy how much? 300. So what do we call that when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied? A shortage. Now, the story we told with international trade is that, hey, no problem, we'll just buy them from the rest of the world. We put a hammer down on that. We can only buy 140. So there's a real shortage. What happens in the face of a shortage to prices? They go up. So prices are going to drift up. And if you'll visualize with me, you don't get this out of the textbook even though they do the same analysis, but I want you to take this horizontal bar and start drifting it up. Up, 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 until it gets wedged in between these two, because at this point, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. The quantity wanting to be purchased now is this amount, which is 270. And the quantity supplied is the amount of exports of 140 plus 130 from domestic producers. Now we'll get to how I rigged this, because you're probably starting to see some similarities here if you look at this one and look at this one. All right, so at the end of the day, under these circumstances, exactly the way I've got them laid out here, the price within that country after the quota is going to be $4. So this is the price in Japan with the quota. All right, so the one little extra thing you can do that hopefully will tie back as you maybe go over this again with your textbook is the supply curve can be shown like this, that this is the supply with a quota. And so that new supply curve with the demand curve ends up intersecting right at that point. And you'll see that as you review that later. So you can kind of approach it in different ways. The reason I wanted to do it this way was to show you the difference between the tariff and the quota, because let's analyze who benefits and who doesn't with the quota versus the tariff. So which one would the rest of the world like better if they were given the choice of a $1 tariff or a 140 unit quota? Which one would they like better? Tariff. Why do you say that? But they're still only selling 140. With the no, because that was before the tariff was imposed. After the tariff was imposed, they were selling 140. So I kind of rigged it to be the same.
Wouldn't they want to do a quota because then the price, like,
Good. That's right. With the quota, they're getting $4 at the end of the day. With the tariff, their net price is $3. So the benefit of the $4 goes to the domestic producers, but the rest of the world, they don't get that benefit. They have to pay the tariff as soon as they bring their Toyotas, they got to pay $1. And so it's a cost to them. They net $3. They still net the world price. So with the quota, they're better because they're getting the 4 at least compared to the other. They're selling the same amount and they're getting a price of 4. How much money is the government collecting with this system? Nothing. So that's kind of the transfer there. That tariff revenue that was here is now in the form of additional profits here for the rest of the world countries that are making the product. So that money kind of gets transferred from, in this scenario, over to the foreign producers. But it's kind of funny money in a way, because they're still not making as much as they would under free trade, but at least it's better than this if that's our alternative. All right, so that's a quota. One of the things that came about in the real world, in fact, it was related to Japan. The Japanese made an offering to the United States to say, ho, 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 I know you guys don't like these awesome Japanese cars coming in and ruin Ford, GM, and Chrysler, so I tell you what, we will voluntarily restrict the amount coming into your country. And the reason they did that was strategic. They could see the brew bubbling in the White House in the United States on policy, thinking that Ford, GM, and Chrysler were successfully lobbying some sort of trade restriction. And they did not want to see a tariff come on the books. And so they invented a new policy called a voluntary export restraint. A voluntary export restraint. This is a VER. It's tied into this. And I'm just going to tie it right back to our example here. Japan volunteers to restrict exports for fear that the importing country may impose a tariff. And we just got done showing that if that's their choices in life, they'd prefer to have a quota rather than a tariff. So they said, hey, wait a second, we'll just do that, no problem. One of the things that we didn't mention directly, I think we kind of did, is subsidies going to companies. So I want to give you this real quick example to leave this with you to ponder. So cotton, like cotton that we make cotton t-shirts and stuff, that's a world product, and the United States dominates that market. The cotton producers have successfully lobbied the politicians to have tariffs in place. The United States, on average, has about $46,000 per person. Now, it turns out that places in Africa that have an income per person of about $570, we're talking the stuff you see on TV, very, very impoverished places, their climate is awesome for growing cotton. And cotton exports make up 55% of their total income. I mean, that's how they make money, right? Meanwhile, the United States, it makes up a fraction of a percent of our total exports. And we continue to pour money to protect the cotton producers in the United States at the expense of the poor nations that have a comparative advantage in the production of that good. So I want to leave you with that. We're going to talk a little bit more on this chapter on policy stuff when we get together again on Friday.